Tonight, as the bombs continue to fall over the Gaza Strip, and the terrible consequences of the decisions being made in that land haunt our ears. We've heard one of those passages from the book of Genesis that has caused a lot of the trouble in the world. We heard God apparently telling Abraham that he and his descendants would be given the land of Canaan, did we not? This is a promise often repeated by those Zionist Jews who claim a divine right to the land called holy. They have faith in this apparent promise of God. They put their faith into it. They believe that it gives them license and permission to claim all the land in that region as theirs. The problem for anyone who wants to treat such an ancient promise literally is that the Arab nations also claim that Abraham is their ancestor through Abraham's son Ishmael. Now, for those who aren't clear of the details, the Jews claim their heritage through Isaac and the Arabs through Ishmael, who was Abraham's firstborn son, but through Hagar, Sarah's maid. The Jewish claim is given added strength by the fact that Isaac, his second son, was born of his wife, Sarah. So in our modern understanding of marriage, he was Abraham's legitimate heir. But Ishmael was born of Hagar by Sarah's own suggestion, because she believed herself to be barren at the time. So Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn son by a legitimate, sanctioned pathway as a result of Sarah's offer. Sarah's maid, Hagar, was essentially a slave. Her body in those days belonged to Sarah, according to the ancient rules. That's why Sarah felt she could essentially use Hagar as a surrogate for a legitimate heir. Do you see the complexity of the issue? Yeah? I can see a lot of nodding going on over here. And Andrew's nodding very enthusiastically. I'm very glad. Yeah. There's a legitimate argument from both the Jews and the Arabs that they are descendants of Abraham. Indeed, we refer to the Jewish and the Muslim faiths as Abrahamic religions, don't we? Because they both count Abraham as their forefather. So which one has the legitimate claim to the promise of the land of Canaan that God made to their ancestor? If an international court were ever asked to decide this question once and for all, I suggest they'd have their work cut out for them. First, they'd need to rule on the issue of legitimacy at the time of Abraham. They'd have to understand what the marriage laws and the laws of heredity were in a time when it was quite frequent that people had many, many wives and concubines and all the rest of it. Secondly, they might be asked to rule on the textual origin of the story itself, and especially of God's promise to Abraham. They'd want to know whether what Michael read to us just now came from the lips of God. If they were to call mainstream scholars to the stand, such scholars would tell them certain facts. Facts such as, since the 19th century, that's the 1800s to you and me, most scholars have believed from a close study of the language, the mythology, the textual clues and the like, that Genesis was written about 500 or 600 years before Christ, and not, as tradition sometimes maintains, by Moses himself half a millennia earlier, about events that happened thousands of years before Moses. They would have to say, these scholars, that it's a largely mythological document, Genesis, It was written at a time when many civilizations were creating myths and stories to explain their origins to themselves and to the people in the lands around them. It was these myths were to give weight to their claims of ownership over certain portions of land, or it was to give authority to the priestly class. We like a bit of authority, us priests. I mean, think about the Greeks, for example. Around the same time that Genesis is being written, they are luxuriating in the Homeric tales and odysseys and poems. The Egyptians, of course, were still reveling in their own mythological stories and their own mythological gods. So an international court called to adjudicate on the claim that God gave the land of Canaan to the Jews, and it says so in Genesis, well, they'd be forced to conclude that such a claim cannot be objectively substantiated. It can only be substantiated by faith. Not from the text, not from the known history of that period. And so we come to the question of faith. Meaning faith in the sense that the Jews mean it when they claim the promise of God to Abraham. And that is one kind of faith. Mark that. It's one kind of faith. It's the kind of faith that gives intellectual assent up here in the brain to a set of ideas or theological statements. It's the kind of faith that decides to accept whether one unevidenced statement is true and another is not. It is by that kind of faith that we might believe or not in the virgin birth, or that the world was created in 6 days, or that Noah actually built an ark to carry all the animals of the world, but somehow forgot the dinosaurs. This is also the kind of faith that has caused wars and conflicts between people of different faith throughout the millennia. It is by faith that Muslims believe that Muhammad was the last and the greatest prophet. It's by such faith that certain Christians assert the divine right of the Bishop of Rome to govern the church. It is by that kind of faith that crusades were led to recapture Jerusalem. It's by that kind of faith that Christians burned each other at the stake over what seem to us today to be rather minor differences in theology. And today that kind of faith, I suggest, is tearing portions of the church apart over what each side believes that God does or does not approve about the state and the sanctity of marriage. Such faith, the willingness to accept or reject various different religious ideas, is a dangerous thing, I suggest to you. There can be no objective proof, you see, for any statement of faith of that kind. There's no way to know objectively whether or not to give intellectual assent to any given religious proposition. And therefore I would argue there is no cause whatsoever for killing each other over such ideas. Do you agree? But there is another kind of faith, one that I think we could accept wholeheartedly and without reservation. I want to argue that the kind of faith I'm talking about is a faith that is about trust. Trusting specifically in a way of life that sets out how to live with integrity according to that way of life. Did you know that Jesus' first followers were not called Christians? In fact, they were called followers of the way. The term Christian was an insult that later we took pride in. But first of all, the first followers were called followers of the way. So when I say that I have faith in Jesus, I don't mean that I'm willing to die for a belief such as the virgin birth or even the bodily resurrection of Jesus. What I mean when I call myself a Christian is that I put my trust in the teachings, the life, and the way of Jesus, the Christ. He showed us by his generous, self-sacrificing, healing, and reconciling life that generosity and sacrifice and healing and reconciling are the only means by which human beings might yet be able to dig ourselves out of the mire. If only we, humanity, could truly grasp the immense power of lives poured out in sacrifice for each other. If only we could grasp the awesome potential of the simple command to love our neighbor. If only we could grasp the incredible possibility of human happiness if we could only learn how to share. Then all the religious propositions, the ideas that we're asked to assent to or disagree with, all those religious propositions which divide us into factions and creeds and denominations and religions could just fade away into the obscurity that I think they deserve. That is a faith worth having, I suggest to you. That's a faith worth living for. And it's even a faith worth dying for. Amen.